Okay, welcome everyone. I am Brent Runyon, Executive Director of the Providence Preservation Society, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here today. I want to give a brief introduction before I hand it off to our moderator for this evening. But before we do, I want to acknowledge that the Providence Preservation Society is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett Nation. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, continued existence of indigenous peoples, and PPS's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. This year's symposium explores housing in all its complexity. For most people, housing is both deeply personal and inherently political. Together with you, we're looking at both dimensions and considering the ways in which preservation can address the housing crisis in Providence and beyond. The program after this is tomorrow at 5:30 p.m., titled All of the Above, Meeting Different Housing Needs with Different Approaches, and tickets are still available. We hope you'll join us. We will be recording this session and it will be shared with all attendees and registrants to the meeting. And I want to thank all of our many sponsors, including especially Cornish Associates, our presenting sponsor, and our session sponsor, Barbara Sokoloff. Affordable housing and historic preservation are often pitted against each other as opposing forces with divergent goals. One seeks to keep housing costs low and supply plentiful. The other places restrictions on development and planning. But the reality is much more complicated than a simple either-or proposition. When applied thoughtfully, preservation tools can actually expand housing supply and spur economic development. New construction cannot be the only solution to the creation of affordable housing, and activating existing buildings plays an important role in solving the housing crisis. Our panel will examine how historic preservation might shed its reputation as exclusionary and instead become part of the affordable housing solution. We are extremely pleased to be joined this afternoon by a distinguished panel of experts. They will discuss the topic at hand for about 60 minutes, leaving time for audience questions. And as you have those questions, please enter them in the Q&A. And now I'm pleased to introduce James Buckley, Associate Professor and Venerable Chair in Historic Preservation at the University of Oregon. Jim previously taught housing policy and community development at MIT and the University of California, Berkeley, and prior to that worked for more than 20 years as a nonprofit developer of affordable housing in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Jim. I'm now pleased to turn it over to you for moderation.
Thank you, Brent, and thank you to the Providence Preservation Society for bringing us all together to discuss what seems like constantly an important topic of affordable housing and preservation. And we do have a lot of expertise with us today in various aspects of both of those topics to discuss the, I like the way you put it, friend and foe. Can it be friend versus foe? It can be both, perhaps. And we can explore those ideas and themes in this conversation. Let me introduce our panel briefly. We're going to hear from Carla DeStefano, who's the Executive Director of SWAP, Stop Wasting Abandoned Property, a nonprofit organization that provides affordable housing opportunities for low and moderate income people and revitalizes urban neighborhoods, often through preservation of historic buildings. Carla. And we have Alyssa Frystak, who's the Director of Research and Data Analytics at PlaceEconomics, which is a well-known firm that's been providing economic analysis of the impacts of historic preservation for more than 30 years. Alyssa. Ethiel Garlington is the Executive Director of Historic Macon, and that group is a mission of revitalizing communities by both preserving architecture and sharing history and providing housing in many ways. Welcome, Ethiel. And we're also joined by Jay O'Grady, who is the Senior Program Officer at LISC in Rhode Island. LISC is an organization that assists low-income communities in housing and economic development. Welcome, Jay. So preservation and housing, as you suggested, Brent, is a very long-term issue. There have been a number of debates over time. Going back to the 60s and 70s, we had urban homesteading and concerns that by gentrification, by displacing low-income households, and in the process of fixing up dilapidated neighborhoods, we had many measures that could restore housing and prevent wholesale change in that process, but we haven't used them always in the best possible ways. At one point, the National Trust had a whole campaign that suburban sprawl was creating problems because it was causing disinvestment in the historic core and included many of the residential neighborhoods. More recently, sustainability has been a question as we emphasize making use of existing structures rather than constructing new homes, and looking at the cost of operating old properties, the energy use and operation versus building new units and trying to recoup the cost of the energy that's already been embodied in old buildings. And more recently, the pressures of climate change have people talking about the need to build more densely in existing urban areas. And as they encourage more density, that's causing problems with people blaming historic preservation for being in the way of creating that kinds of density that we need, and criticizing especially historic districts as an obstacle to trying to allow for enough housing units to serve the needs, the high demand that we have in our urban areas. So this has been a product of debate for a long time, and we have some very particular issues today. I've asked each of our panelists to take a few minutes here at the beginning to explain their work, what they've been doing, and to talk about the issues that they see today in this relationship between historic preservation and affordable housing. And as Brent mentioned, please put questions that you have as we go into the Q&A, and we'll come back and pick those up as we go along. And our first panelist to talk will be Carla DeStefano. And Carla, as I mentioned, is with SWAP. Carla, your organization goes back to the 70s and trying to fight displacement and deterioration of historic neighborhoods. And I remember even arson at that time being a problem and trying to get hold of those issues. And you had a big urban homesteading program at that time. And since then, you wound up building or renovating over 1,000 houses and working with historic neighborhoods to try and keep those thriving while at the same time providing affordable housing for people. So the question is, Carla, is it friend and foe or friend or foe for historic preservation and affordable housing? You've still got your mute on.
Okay, so well, I would say in Providence, we're very, very fortunate that we're kind of a preservation, very friendly preservation city. That being said, we don't have a lot of the same issues there are across the country. We need more housing, we need more affordable housing. And you know, our neighborhoods, we're a very parochial state. We like our neighborhoods, we like our communities. So I would say it's been very friendly here, friendly from the preservation perspective, and preservation and affordable housing has been something we have been very successful at. I mean, we are, most people when they come to Providence really kind of only recognize the real historic preserved area over on the east side near the university. But our office sits in the Pine Street Historic District on the south side. And this is a community where immigrants continue to this day to come into America. They don't necessarily get off a boat at a pier in South Providence, but this has historically been the first stop. And so we have what became, you know, mill housing, worker housing, middle management housing, and of course, the bosses housing and the owner's housing across the south side. So we at SWAP in our history, and I've been here the whole history, but I've been here for more than 25 years, have made a point of using all of the resources that are available to develop affordable rental and homeownership housing with historic tax credits when appropriate to, at the very least, restore and preserve the exterior of buildings. And we've been very successful at it. And I would like to say that if you drive the historic Pine Street Historic District today, you will note very easily how that happened. So here we've been very lucky, but I will say that it has not been easy. It's more expensive. It's always a little bit more expensive. You know, we're in a crazy time right now across the country. Housing is expensive. renovation is expensive, building, everything is expensive, but preservation does add some cost to it, and something that we're all suffering across the country, which is that we're beginning to find that we cannot find the craftspeople to do the work, from wood carving to turning spindles and that sort of thing. So I think that's becoming as big a problem as even the cost. And so we're lucky here in Providence. I don't know where folks are listening from. And we will begin to have to fight even harder, I think, because of the cost of the historic preservation, to acquire older buildings in this crazy real estate market and then raise the funds to restore. One of the things when you talk about density, Providence is, I don't know that it's unique, but we don't like big buildings here in Providence. So we fight big buildings to maintain our neighborhood of 2 and 3 family houses. When people come to Providence, they call them flats in other cities. We're a 2-flat or a 3-flat city. People who live here like that kind of neighborhood. Families have been able to buy a home, have extended family live, whether it's an old home or a newly built home, in an apartment in the house. So we don't knock down too many of these houses. We do tend to preserve them, but I suspect, and Brett, I can't see his picture, but he's probably cringing because he probably knows of some of them that have been destroyed. And some of them have probably been by the university over there on the east side. So it is contentious in some neighborhoods in the city. So I hope I addressed what it is. Yeah.
Let me ask you about development pressures. I know there's a new commuter train, and I'm sure the university expands often. So
Yep.
Are you seeing a lot of pressure on the historic building stock to be demolished for larger or newer buildings?
I certainly don't see much of it on the south side. I mean, it's not like the other neighborhoods in the city are that far away. I don't see it in many of the neighborhoods, the west side. The east side is challenged. The university has been a challenge. They have, and it's really not just the commuter. I've been in several real estate booms and busts, or busts and booms, in my real estate career, both in Rhode Island and for-profit, nonprofit. And yeah, people get on the train and they come from Boston and they pay more money, but now they're coming from New York and they're coming from other places. So that pressure is there. And they do drive up the prices, but we're still restoring them because that's why they come here. So it's the yin and the yang. This is about affordable housing and preservation. I would like to be able to do more of it. For me to buy a big house that's a single family and be able to make it 4 apartments, mean that that's density in the neighborhood. And we have done that pretty successfely. We may not have been the first group to come in and create, multiple units in some of these big structures, but I'm going to say we have gone in and done a much better job of, meeting the current building codes and so forth and so on. But I can't blame the big bad Bostonites or New Yorkers in terms of, the whole thing. They've been here before, they've stayed, they've been good neighbors, and, they may leave, but it's a pressure. I've been at SWAP for 27 years. We're across the highway, if you will, for most of the major redevelopment in the city. And I have said this often, the threat of real gentrification in terms of, once again, pushing people out of the affordable neighborhoods is bad as it has ever been in my 27 years here. The pressure on having affordable apartments and home ownership available to low to mid modern income Rhode Islanders is extremely great right now. And I don't see how it's ever going to be fixed, to be honest with you, but density helps for sure.
Great, thanks. It's good to hear from a Portland perspective that we're not preserving and we're not creating affordable housing either. So it's good to know your experience. Let's turn to Alyssa, who has a great perspective because she is working with PlaceEconomics that has been involved with looking at these kinds of issues for a long time and Alyssa herself has a preservation degree from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And she also studied this as an undergrad as well at UIC there. So Alyssa, you've been looking at different communities and you guys compile a lot of statistics and facts. Can you help us solve this dilemma of friend and foe versus friend versus foe?
Yeah, we study cities and states all over the country, and affordable housing is something that comes up a lot, and that our clients kind of want to know. They want to understand how older housing is meeting, affordable housing goals in their community, or maybe not reaching those goals in their community. So kind of before I want to present a couple like myths a little bit that we at PlaceEconomics have tried to develop some methodologies to use data-based arguments to kind of start to reframe this narrative that preservation is a foe of affordable housing. Because I don't think that we've really seen great evidence of that. So before I dive into that, I'm just going to in the chat drop a link to our resources page at PlaceEconomics. And there you can find all of the studies and reports that we've conducted for all these other cities around the country. Oops, I think I just put it to the panelists. Hold on one sec. There we go. All right, so you can check out that link for any of the data and stuff that I'll mention. So one thing that we hear quite often at PlaceEconomics is that historic preservation, specifically historic districts, prevent the creation of affordable housing, right? We all have seen those articles in the New York Times and Forbes. Some of those articles even go as far as saying that historic districts directly cause homelessness. However, when you look at the total land area in most cities that are actually under the purview of historic regulation, that criticism kind of seems preposterous, right? We found in our research that in most cases, historic districts make up less than 10% of any city's overall land area. And oftentimes it's actually much less than that even. So in Los Angeles and Nashville, historic districts only make up 6% of the city's land area. In New York City, it's only 4%. And in cities like Phoenix and Chicago, it's actually only 1%. So it's more nuanced than just historic districts prevent affordable housing. What determines housing affordability is much more a function of zoning, the market, policy, and the public sector priorities, rather than just 3 to 5% of the city's land area. So on top of that, in our analysis, we've also found that housing is more affordable in areas with a concentration of older non-designated housing, or in historic districts that designate more vernacular type housing typologies. And that was definitely the case when we looked in San Antonio, Los Angeles, and Phoenix. So importantly, historic districts make up a very small share of a city's land area. They often already contain affordable housing, especially in areas that are composed of more vernacular housing typologies. And then finally, high housing costs are more a function of a bunch of different variables rather than one single culprit, such as affordable or historic preservation regulation. Another myth that we encounter a lot is people saying that in order to make our cities more affordable, we have to add more density. But however, in city after city, we've found that historic districts are actually some of the densest areas in most cities. We find that they tend to have a population density that's 2 to 5 times higher than that of non-designated residential areas. And this is due in part to smaller lot and building sizes, and the presence of accessory dwelling units, like coach houses and granny flats, as well as legacy zoning practices that allow for small scale multifamily structures. So historic districts comprise such a small share of the city's land area, and they're already providing gentle density. So I think it's safe to say that historic districts are doing their part to provide density in our cities.
Sorry,
Um,
Alyssa, did you just say gentle density?
Gentle density.
I'm
Yeah,
writing that down. I like that. I'm writing
yeah,
that down.
that's what we like to call it, because it's hidden density, right? It's literally like I have a garage just to my left right here that could easily have an apartment in it. There's also a basement unit in my building, so it's all these little places where we can add one more unit of housing, and not, as opposed to not gentle density, which would be those residential skyscrapers. I think another myth that we come across is that older buildings are really expensive to maintain, and or fix, and therefore they have to come down. But in one of our studies for the city of San Antonio, we were able to really dive deep into this myth that, it's too expensive to maintain. And that was because their assessment records contain detailed information regarding building condition. And so there, not surprisingly, we found that a larger share of housing that was built prior to 1960 was in average or fair condition, as opposed to housing built after 1960, right? But however, according to the assessor's office, average condition simply means that defects can be quickly and cheaply resolved. And fair condition means that minor repairs are needed to bring the building up to standards. So it kind of proves that, at least in San Antonio, the number of older housing units that truly warrant demolition due to astronomical rehab costs is kind of fewer than most developers would want to admit. We've also found, we came across another study that said that the average cost to build a new low-income housing tax credit unit was on average $47,000 more per unit than the cost that it would be to acquire and rehab a low-income housing tax credit unit. So this kind of confirms that it's more cost-effective in some cases to preserve existing affordable housing than it is to build new. And kind of in that same vein, we have two theories, two mantras at PlaceEconomics that we use quite often. Some of these you might have heard before. So the first is that you can't buy new and rent or sell cheap, at least without deep subsidies. And the second is that every unit of older housing that's lost is a unit of potentially affordable housing lost. And I just want to bring one more final analysis that we've done that kind of provides a real world example to confirm those two beliefs. And I'll drop the link for that. It was actually a little blog post that we did as a micro analysis. So here in Chicago, as I'm sure, I don't know where everyone else is joining from, but in Chicago, we see a lot of small scale multifamily residential teardowns. And those buildings are either replaced with new luxury condos or single family homes. And so I went literally down the block for me, and I found a couple of buildings in my neighborhood that I wanted to use to test those two theories on. So the first was a 1909 3-flat apartment building. The second was a mid-century 5-flat apartment building. And the third was a 3-unit condo building built in 2018. So those buildings, they all sit right next to each other. And though they're on a street that with a lot of extant housing and like very little infill, the street is not protected in any way. It's not part of a historic district. So what we found when we looked at the assessment data and the rent data was that on a square foot basis, apart from having an assessed value that was 3 times greater than the 1909 building, units in the new building also rented for twice as much as those in the 1909 building. And doing a little bit more digging in the assessment records, we also found that the 2018 building had replaced an earlier, 19 or late 19th, early 20th century cottage style 3-flat. And that 3-flat was undoubtedly probably providing naturally occurring affordable housing. So even though that's like a little micro analysis, really only looking at three buildings on one block, it's kind of easy to extrapolate that and recognize that if that pattern continues and that, one building gets knocked down again and again and again throughout a whole city, it really has, it creates a chain reaction for property values in the surrounding neighborhood. And we kind of have come to the conclusion that, as long as the market in an area is strong enough, when older housing gets torn down, that lot is rarely ever affordable again. And then that has long-term implications for the affordability of the surrounding community. So those are just some of the things that we found, some of the myths that we try to use data-based arguments to start to reframe and reshape. But yeah.
Great. Thanks. It's helpful to have both the numbers, but also the specifics of particular sites. And you mentioned typologies. And if you think about what Carla was saying with the 2-flat, 3-flat, or the triple deckers, and you're talking about these 1 to 4 unit buildings in Chicago that are typically mom and pop owned as opposed to corporate owned, and they have relationships. And so maybe they're keeping rents that are more affordable because they know the people that are in the same building. That's one example of how the numbers may not give the example of what is really going on in these sites. So I appreciate your talking about those kinds of aspects. Thanks, Alyssa. Let's turn to Ethiel because he's got lots of examples of reusing historic buildings for affordable housing. And Historic Macon Foundation has been doing this a while. Ethiel, you've been doing this for a while, going back to some time as a preservation carpenter and working with craftspeople, and then working with a variety of historic sites in both Georgia and Tennessee. And right now, I like your website's description that you use innovative real estate tactics, historic tax credits, advocacy, educational program, and low interest loan programs to help redo historic properties to provide a variety of community needs. So can you tell us a little bit more? I'm assuming that you're on the end of preservation as a friend, but maybe you'll find some faux aspects as well.
Well, absolutely. And thank you again for the opportunity to join this esteemed panel. So, and also this is a nice segue. Alyssa and the team at PlaceEconomics are actually currently in the process of doing a study in Macon of 3 of our neighborhoods that we've been working on. So we're eager to see that data and excited to see some of these results. So I'll just kind of give you a quick overview of our work at Historic Macon and talk through kind of my personal approach to this question and this issue. So Historic Macon has been working in the real estate space for about 30 years. And the way we really started was focusing on one neighborhood at a time. And what we found was that focusing our resources, not only financial, but human resources and political capital, we could really transform neighborhoods in a positive way. But of course, what that meant was that we were using, oftentimes we were using grant funds or low interest loans from different funders to essentially subsidize these neighborhoods and these revitalization efforts. And I think to Alyssa's point, even Carla's point, that the idea that a lot of these affordable housing units and these opportunities do not happen without some sort of subsidy. And so whether that's historic tax credits or the low income tax credits, these deals just don't happen without it. So, but to be candid, most of our work going back 30 years has been focused on market rate homeowner occupied housing. What we found was that a lot of these neighborhoods were had seen disinvestment, they had declined, they were abandoned, frankly. And so our organization bought houses and fixed them up and then sold them as specifically owner-occupied housing. And over the years, that's been successful because it's been a balance in these neighborhoods. Oftentimes in the neighborhoods, there's already some affordable housing or some rental housing options in the neighborhoods. And frankly, as a preservationist, I like to work in places with soft real estate markets. And so working in a place like Macon, Georgia, our real estate market is so soft that when I got to town 8 years ago and people would ask me about the potential of gentrification in these neighborhoods, I sort of brushed it off, just thinking that, again, the market here is so soft. None of the work that we are doing is, drawing speculators into these neighborhoods. But of course, that's a naive sentiment because we've all seen and been in neighborhoods long enough to see that that does happen. And so just in the 8 years that I've been here, these neighborhoods are transforming and they are getting more expensive. And on one hand, for our revolving fund model, it relies on a market rate housing opportunity where we are trying to push up the sales prices of homes, not only so we can pay back our funders, but it also builds equity for long-term residents in the neighborhood. And one of the things that we found from the beginning of our work is that we only work in neighborhoods where we are invited, where we are working in collaboration with long-term residents. And the intent of our programs is to be sort of a wide array of menu options that a lot of times create this false real estate market. So not only are we using free money or low interest money to create market rate housing, but we're also offering programs like low interest loans for facade or energy efficiency improvements. We're also offering programs like a down payment assistance to incentivize people to actually live in the neighborhoods. And offering tax credits, historic tax credits. Georgia has a very favorable property tax freeze and a tax credit program. So we can get people, home buyers, into these houses for sometimes $300 to $400 a month and essentially a brand new historic house using a lot of these tools. Because oftentimes we're losing about $25,000 per house on these rehabs. We're also building new infill housing. And so we know that there are empty lots in the neighborhoods that, these missing teeth that we need to fill in. We also know, frankly, that some buyers just don't want a historic house. And so we're able to provide these variety of housing options. But again, to the point of the friend or foe, we have pushed the markets up. These are now more expensive neighborhoods. And so just in the past 3 years, we have sort of taken another approach and added a new tool to our model, and that is buy and hold rental housing. And this is something our organization had not done for a long time, but now the idea is that we do not want to leave these neighborhoods and just sort of declare victory and have these, very healthy neighborhoods. We want to make sure that we are buying and holding real estate so that as these neighborhoods continue to improve and escalate, we want to be able to control these rental rates. And so just this summer, we were the beneficiaries of a $600,000 grant from our local county government through the ARPA funds that were quickly matched by the Knight Foundation. And so we'll have $1.2 million to build probably 12 affordable units. We will hold those in perpetuity. And then the cool thing is that will be a new revolving fund for us. So we'll build those 12 units, there'll be duplexes, and then we will use that asset and that equity to then build those in other neighborhoods. And so that's a way that we can guarantee that there will be housing diversity options in these neighborhoods, in these successful neighborhoods for the long term. And so I think that's just one way that we can learn and evolve with these, with these markets and with the education that we're getting. But we don't have it all figured out. And so we're continuing to learn. So using tools like the PlaceEconomics data, we're excited to see, what programs should we be introducing in the next neighborhood that we work in. So I'm happy to answer questions later.
Great. I love that you're thinking as you're developing in a neighborhood, you're thinking ahead and saying, well, we could be too successful here, and trying to build in some affordability as the neighborhood is going up in value. And I always feel like people wait too late to do that. Sounds like you're thinking about it and that you're able to capture any rise in value over time while you're keeping the units that you've constructed as lower income units, and then use some of that equity in the next project that you're doing. So that's very exciting. Great. Okay, Jay O'Grady from the LISC organization. Jay also has a political perspective because he spent several years in the Rhode Island General Assembly and was also a local leader in his hometown of Lincoln, Rhode Island. So hopefully he can bring us some political perspective on this as well. So Jay, where do you stand on this range of friend or foe for affordable housing and historic preservation?
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to attend or to participate today, I should say. Yeah, and I want to give an example from my time on the Lincoln Town Council, and I'm not sure where all of the participants are from, but for those who may not be from the state of Rhode Island, Lincoln is a municipality in the Blackstone Valley, so north central portion of Rhode Island. And the Blackstone River itself was, the sort of the lifeblood of the early American Industrial Revolution. And so its banks are literally, lined from Worcester through Pawtucket with former textile mill and associated mill-like structures, all of which are, very much historic and very characteristic of this part of the world. Lincoln is no exception to that rule. The town of Lincoln itself is, as is the case with many municipalities, both in Rhode Island and Massachusetts along the Blackstone River, Lincoln is a collection of mill villages. So within the municipality of Lincoln, you have Manville, Lonsdale, Fairlawn, Salesville, Lime Rock, and Quinville. And with the exception of Lime Rock, each of these others, were centered around a very specific mill and a residential and/or commercial component that was built up to support that mill. So in the town of Lincoln, we, again have several mill complexes that, at one point were thriving, and as the either the textile industry moved south, in the early 1900s, or the textile machinery operations, which were a little more capital versus labor intensive than the actual textile operations themselves. They lasted, through the end of World War II and in some cases into the early 60s, but eventually they left as well. And so in Lincoln, we had two mill complexes in particular that we were very interested in trying to preserve. They were, part and parcel of our sense of who we are as a town. And so those would be the Lonsdale Bleachery Complex and the Salesville Mill Complex. And so around the time that I joined the Lincoln Town Council in 2004, both of these were largely disused, certainly underutilized, and very much in danger of being destroyed, whether it be by fire or just benign neglect. And so, we decided when I was, the council president in Lincoln, that we would try to not kill two birds with one stone, because that is, making it seem like we weren't interested in doing either, but to address two problems at the same time. And one, that was lack of affordable housing in the town of Lincoln. And the other was, the imperative to attempt to save these historic structures. And so we performed a comprehensive review and redraft of our zoning ordinance, which created what we call the Mill Conversion Overlay District. And we were deliberate in where that overlay district lie. Obviously, it went around mill districts, including the Lonsdale Bleachery Complex, as well as the Salesville Mill Complex. And our assumption at the time was that neither of these mill complexes would be able to cobble together the resources necessary to repurpose them in a meaningful way without availing themselves of every bit of subsidy that was out there, including historic, or not just including historic tax credits, but also low-income housing tax credits. And so what the Mill Conversion Overlay District mandates is that in the event that you are going to repurpose any mill building that falls, within those districts with a residential component of any sort, you would be required to include 25% of the residential units created as deed restricted affordable units. We were attempting to address the fact that the town of Lincoln falls below the 10% deed restricted unit mandate that's contained within the Rhode Island Low and Moderate Income Housing Act. And so we were, spurred, we were reminded of the immediacy of this issue when the Lonsdale Bleachery Complex, before anything could be done with it, had a catastrophic fire that has resulted in the raising of at least 60% of the structure that was there. But I am happy to report that the Salesville Mill Complex has now had two, which is a sprawling, collection of mill buildings. There's probably 25 or 30 of them that are in that complex. Has had several of them now either redeveloped for affordable housing. And I'm thinking of the Lincoln Lofts project, which was advanced just a couple of years ago by a for-profit development group out of Waltham, Mass, called Dakota Partners. It's now 50 loft units, 100% of which are deed restricted affordable, supported by not only federal historic tax credits, but also low-income housing tax credits and a number of other subsidy sources. And just within the last week, a 126 unit project in 4 of the largest Salesville Mill buildings, successfully got through the Lincoln planning process. And there will be 126 units within this. It's going to be a mixed use project, but there'll be 126 residential units within this, within what is being referred to as the Walker Lofts project, and 32 of that 126 will be deed restricted affordable, and deed restricted for 30 years, both in that case and in the Lincoln Lofts project that I mentioned a moment ago. So in Lincoln, we were very deliberate about being not a foe, but being a friend and being mutually supportive. Again, trying to not kill 2 birds with 1 stone, but address 2 very real needs at the same time. I think that we did that. It was a shame not to see the city of Pawtucket, in my opinion. Apologies if there's anyone from Pawtucket on here who would disagree with that. But from my perspective, it's a shame that the city of Pawtucket did not embrace a similar overlay concept for what's called the Connet Thread District, which is a district that will be within which the new MBTA commuter rail station that you mentioned, Jim, in your opening remarks, will be opening next year. There's probably 1 million square feet of badly underutilized and decaying, some of which was lost in a pretty significant fire about a year ago. But plenty remains, and it's a shame to me that the city of Pawtucket did not embrace a similar design when they put their mill district overlay together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jay. I think what you're getting at is incentives to meet the need as it develops, and that having some kind of requirement that if you're going to do fancy lofts or some kind of new commercial development, that you're going to be contributing to keeping meeting the needs of low-income people who are already in that community through that. It relates, I think, to what Ethiel was saying about they're building the low-income housing now, and as the market continues to change there, that there will be people able to stay there, and there will be a mix of incomes in that community. So I'm seeing these incentives or these ways of trying to require that we maintain affordability with historic preservation as one theme we might be thinking about A second one, I still love that gentle density. So I'm thinking about the typologies, and I see there's a question about that and how we work with this. I'm thinking of every fall, I take the introductory class out to a neighborhood and we walk through the neighborhood and talk about what we're seeing. And one of the things I really was thinking about this time was how there were back buildings or units had been broken up, and that something that looked like it was a big single family house actually had 3 or 4 units in it. So maybe that's contributing to affordability in a way that we aren't focusing on. So I love that concept. A third theme might be about community engagement. And we're seeing that in SWAP, of course, and we're seeing that in Macon, and that people, and Jay, you were a representative of people, so you were incorporating community ideas, that people were involved in how this change might take place, and that they were watching to make sure that the communities, all the community's needs were being met. And then finally, maybe there's something about a sense of place. And I know that preservation has really changed from when I first started, that we're really focused on telling all of our histories and making sure everyone's included in the conversation. And I'm a little concerned that when we fight these battles of historic preservation is causing a problem, well, actually, more and more we're working in neighborhoods where there are other stories that we haven't looked at. And shouldn't those folks be able to take advantage of historic preservation tools to preserve their history? And yes, we don't want to just designate a place and have everyone be gentrified out, but maybe we can think about using historic preservation to help people who have a different story that might be important in keeping them together and keeping that neighborhood in with the kind of character it's had over time. So let me, with those themes in mind or anything else that you're working on, let me invite members of the panel to talk to each other. Maybe you picked out something that someone said that you really agree with, or maybe you disagree with, or want to know more about what someone else is doing. So would anyone like to jump in and kind of confirm or confront anybody else with things that you've been thinking about?
I can jump in. I am very, very familiar with what they're doing in Macon. I'm deep in the data of it now, but that model of buying and holding is really, really important. And it's not a tool that's used very often. And what that helps prevent is that speculative development, because that's really where, right, prices start to go up and it really starts to change the ecosystem of the neighborhood. And so I know you guys are buying and holding and using it as rental property, but there's also another model, and I can't remember the organization that uses this, but basically in exchange for granting money to, rehab a building, they require that the person who's receiving the money stay in that home for at least 5 years. And so that, again, kind of prevents like some developer coming in, rehabbing it, and then flipping it and making a huge profit off of it, because that's a very speculative thing that can have a negative impact on the neighborhood. So, there's different models of that kind of rehab or acquire, rehab, and hold model that there can be. So I applaud you guys for exploring that model in Macon.
Great. There's another tool. Ethiel, is that working for you?
Yeah, and I think so. And I think one of the tools, or one of the programs of our state historic tax credit, is that if you use it on a historic residence, which we're doing on our rehabs that we're selling, Alyssa's exactly right. So in our case, if you don't stay there for the full 5 years, you have to pay back a prorated portion of it, and the same with the down payment assistance. So Mercer University is one of our best partners in the community or in our neighborhood work, which seems counterintuitive for a lot of communities, I think. But Mercer University early on realized that it was in their best interest, enlightened self-interest, if you will, to improve the neighborhoods just outside of their campus walls. And for decades, they literally told their students not to venture out off campus, and they had a fence, and it was very very limiting. But what they realized was that they can't live on an island. And so that when they had potential students coming to visit, or when they had parents come visit their students, they had to kind of go through these neighborhoods. And so by using the down payment assistance, what they've done is they've incentivized their professors and their staff to look first to Bells Hill, which is the neighborhood that we're working in. And that's a $20,000 down payment assistance that really gets your attention if you're new to the community. And what we found is that a lot of our buyers are people who have lived in similar neighborhoods and cities across the country. And so they're very active in the neighborhood association. They see the benefits of walking their children to the local elementary school, walking to the parks, and of course, walking to class. So I do think there are lots of these little sort of relatively low investment tools that can help incentivize and stabilize neighborhoods.
Great. Carla, what's been your experience with these kinds of efforts to keep things affordable?
Well, until about 2 years ago, I don't want to say it was easy, but acquiring property, whether they were houses to preserve or vacant blighted lots, to be able to build some infill housing, affordable housing. We're an affordable housing agency that has focused where we can in this neighborhood on the preservation of the historic homes that are here. So, our mission is neighborhood revitalization through housing. So this is a little bit different. We also do home ownership, and I think we're in a very different market here than Macon. I'd love to be able to deal with numbers where a $20,000 down payment is going to get someone a house, and whether we're renovating. One of the problems with our houses, our historic homes here, they're large. Many of them are very big. So whether they're 2 or 3 family houses or single family houses, as a single family are broken up, they're very, very large houses. So the cost of them, even if you have the most up-to-date HVAC systems and insulation and so forth, is still very expensive for a low-income family. So our typical home buyer is at 60% AMI in this neighborhood. So our mission, our goal, and what it is we do here is we serve the income of the people who live here. Okay, we're not looking to attract someone else. You can come from somewhere else. That's not what it is. But our market are literally people who walk through our door and make an application either for a rental apartment or a home to buy, and we go from there. So even though the market is going crazy elsewhere, we are now, we're using upwards of $150,000, $160,000, $75,000 of subsidy per home, per unit, okay, right now to make housing affordable to that market. So we don't really have a cottage community left where we can do what you're doing in Macon. We've done a little bit of that over the years. But it's just not that kind of market where just small amounts of money. What you're talking about, Alyssa, was anti-speculation, 5-7 year, you have to live there. So, many of the subsidy programs we're using require a deed restriction of up to 30 years. I personally have an issue with that in terms of, I'm going to say making, the push right now nationally, and you all know this, is to help lower income and minority community members, or, build wealth through home ownership. Like, put a 30-year deed restriction on it. What kind of wealth are you building? It's probably not going to help you educate your kids through college and so forth and so on. So I'm sort of on a mission to get some of those reduced, but that'll probably take a while. So it's a different market. The reason we use, tax credits, low income and historic tax credits to renovate these houses is if we didn't do that and create long-term rental housing, an awful lot of people who have lived here for generations would have been moved out through gentrification. Developers who buy these houses have, stripped them and put vinyl siding up on them and flipped them, to Alyssa and Ethiel's point, and sold them. And they've just sort of, been left for is nothing really terrific. So we're mission driven to our market, which is 60% AMI. There are a lot of market forces here that are driving the sale prices of houses up to $300,000, $400,000, and $500,000 in this neighborhood of people who are earning 60% of area median income for a family of four, about $40,000 a year. So we are definitely swimming upstream right now in this area.
Yeah, thanks for defining AMI for those who don't know what that is.
I'm sorry, anybody, yes. So
that is the sort of upper limit of the low-income housing tax credit. And so that represents a lot of working families and people who just have average jobs and can't afford necessarily to buy in those kinds of communities. Carla, can you talk about, for people who are in similar situations as yours, where you're getting the money for that 175 plus thousand subsidy for each of these units? Is that coming from the State Housing Finance Agency, from foundations, or what kind of places are you finding that kind of money?
Well, I made a list. So, on the rental side, a typical rental project, we just finished a preservation of a large part of our rental portfolio. I think there were 8 sources of funding in there, from 4% tax credits, home, Federal Housing Trust Fund, a LISC, CDBG, home from the city, home from the state HFA. So you can't do much here without working in Providence directly with the city and the HFA. So we get money from both of them. So typically, right now, the state of Rhode Island has passed a big bond. We don't have a huge philanthropic. I mean, to get $1 million, to be able to get a grant, Ethiel, for $600,000 and then another $600,000 matching amount of money, pretty much unheard of here for any kind of production. We have some philanthropic support for programmatic and staffing capacity building, but we're pretty much reliant on most of the federal programs. The state did pass a bond in a special election back in March, and they put $65 million into a fund. We're the last state in New England to actually have a permanent source of, or a steady stream of funding. I think it has started with, some tax on the sale of real estate. So we're strapped. I mean, it's hard. It's very hard. And we compete, and all of those programs are competitive. We have a very long and solid history of building new on vacant blighted lots, a couple of different designs that we have, but by far the most popular home we build is a 3-bedroom with a one bedroom rental unit with it right now. And everyone on our list wants a 2-family. We have a large Latino community, a lot of extended family. So that just requires more money. Even the per unit cost is lower, but it's expensive right now. It's expensive. It costs close to $450,000 to build a 2-family house right now with what the cost of construction is right here. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks. Because this is one of the things I don't miss about affordable housing development, which you are expert in, of how you have 10 to 12 sources of funding for each project. Each one has its own rules, and you have to try and sort these all out. So there's a real expertise in making this work, which is why groups like yours are so important. And Ethiel's, you know this way to do it. So in preservation, people say, yeah, we want to encourage affordability at the same time we're fixing up the homes. They have to understand that it's not just easy. You don't go down to HUD anymore and get a large subsidy and put it into it. You really got to use a lot of different sources. The other thing I think is important out of this is that people from preservation side who want to support affordable housing have to support things like that bond issue. You have to be the one going down there and saying, yeah, I'm for preserving these units for affordable housing. And to do that, we've got to have the government subsidies in place. We've got to make sure that philanthropies are involved in this. So there are many ways in which preservations can be true friends of affordable housing that we aren't always aware of. And you guys are really showing us how we make that work.
I'll just finish with this. We just, a couple of years ago, finished a 40-unit, newly constructed rental development with 9% low-income housing tax credits. And we self-manage our property. It's not my expertise, but I do know an awful lot about it. We have 7 different funding sources with 7 different sets of rental rules and regulations in 40 units.
Yeah, that's just nutty, and trying to place the right person in the right one to make sure you don't screw up the tax credits is very, very complicated.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's see if we have what questions we have, because we have about half an hour left and I want to make sure we address these. One of the first ones is from Housing Works Rhode Island, and they're asking about the cost of rehabilitation and that's expensive to do. And they're trying to figure out what they should preserve based on these kinds of issues. Does anyone have a response in terms of how you sort the issue out of how much it costs to redo these units, to do them correctly, to reflect the kinds of standards that you want to use for this? How do you work on these kinds of issues?
Well, you need a lot of expertise. You can, and I'm going to say we have a very technically expert staff here in that department, and we use all of our historic data. We use current data. We go out to bid. We following national trends, local trends, and you collect all of that data, and you look at a house, and you go to an architect, you go to a builder, and you put all of that experience together and you find out what it's going to cost. I'm not sure I really understand the question, but I think, I mean, that's the process, is whether it's historic or it's new, you have to be studying every day. I mean, you know, I'm in an old historic building. My office is an old historic, we are in an old historic building in the district. And, you know, we call it the 3rd floor. Up in the 3rd floor, they've got the red pens. Anything we want to do on the 2nd floor, which are we're on the development side, they're on the design and construction side. They're constantly reminding us it's expensive, whether it's historic preservation or not. So it's just data, networking with all the craftspeople and so forth. It doesn't just happen. You've got to do an awful lot of homework and due diligence.
Great.
Jim,
Well,
go ahead,
I'm sure
Jay.
you're gonna agree with that. So why don't you let us know?
Go ahead, Jay. You go.
Well, I would just say to add on to what Carla said, if you are developing or redeveloping a historic building to provide affordable housing units, you are, at least in Rhode Island, you are most likely using a subsidy source that at some level is controlled by Rhode Island Housing, which is our state mortgage finance agency, but also really the gatekeeper for all affordable housing subsidy sources. And they have some spec-based requirements that they tie back to the subsidy sources, whether it be low-income housing tax credits or home funds or whatever. And I think that the concept there is that you want to, if you're going to be using these subsidy sources, you're going to be producing a unit that will last for a particular period of time, and that means certain treatments, certain finishes, certain appliances, certain it gets very rigorous. So we've had prior to joining LISC, I worked for a group similar to Carla's, and we were developing some what had been mill worker housing, probably built in the 1890s, so would qualify as historic. And we're in lousy shape, but we were going to preserve them, and we developed a spec that would have returned a respectable product, but it was not sufficient to meet Rhode Island Housing's muster, and so we had to increase that spec pretty significantly, which of course increased cost pretty significantly. So I think that there's that element is always, it's not just what you want to do, it's what your funding sources will allow you to do.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just kind of throw out a couple other things. So for the past 5 years, we've had a small construction crew in-house at Historic Macon. We're a nonprofit organization, and it's so we have a licensed general contractor on staff. And what that does is that not only keeps those expenses in-house, but it helps us control the product in a way that we couldn't do with an outside general contractor. And so that means that we're able to save more materials, we're able to get a better quality product and for less money. And so if there is an opportunity, I think, to bring some of that in-house, you might be able to do that. And then I think going back to these like multiple funding streams for these projects, we have, with the historic tax credits, we have sort of developed this small boutique syndication business in Macon. And so we do tax credit consulting for outside clients, but in addition to that, we offer a syndication service where we put out an offer letter to mostly CPAs or frankly, wealthy people in our community. And we're able to bring equity into these deals, not just for our projects, but for other projects by syndicating the tax credits, mostly locally. And so I think that might be something they could look into.
That's great that you're actually getting community support on the investment side too. And so local people have a stake in it and they know what's going on and can see the result of it as well. And it's interesting that you are doing that beyond your own units because you have to have a certain scale to make that kind of syndication work, but you've been able to figure out how to make that happen. So that's impressive. Great. Alyssa, anything you want to jump in on costs, any data that we could use for understanding it, how to do this?
You know, we kind of just study the effects that it has afterwards in the community. But yeah, I'm always interested to hear, especially comparing costs of rehabbing versus new construction, because you know, a lot of times we hear like, oh well, we have to demo this so we can build more housing. But it's, you know, I'm not sure in your guys' case if you found that it's more economical to rehab than it is to build new. So I'm always interested in hearing those perspectives.
Depends on the property, depends on the age of the property. It depends on the workforce that's available in our market right now. I'm going to say we've lost between the 2008 real estate crisis and COVID, we've probably lost an awful lot of craftsmen to retirement or job changing. And we're struggling. We are struggling here in Rhode Island to have enough people in the workforce period. So it really depends. And rehabilitation has taken the biggest hit. Most builders want to get out clean. They want to go out, they want to build new. And they are in the suburban community. So it's tough. It's tough. And we have tried in the past to have our own crew. We did not find that work. It limited it limited what we could do. So we've opted for expertise on our staff to oversee small neighborhood contractors as well as larger contractors. So, you know, we have been through that, and it did not work out as well. And quite frankly, it limits our capacity. We want to do more work than we could do with a small crew ourselves. So we tried it. We've done it over the years.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that we at PlaceEconomics hear that all the time, that issue of the labor force for these historic trades is not here. And, you know, we're also going to be doing a study that looks into that. And we're finding that pipeline for historic trades professionals is retiring and the pipeline coming in is not there. So I think that this is going to be an issue that we have for the next, long while in preservation. Hopefully we can fix it before it's, these tradesmen die out altogether,
Rhode Island is supporting a pretty aggressive apprenticeship program, both through the union trades and the non-union trades. And it's catching on, and the legislature is being lobbied very hard to make sure that the state puts money into the Department of Labor so that these programs can survive. And I would say they're probably, I won't call them thriving, but they're probably doing better now than they have because of the shortage of the workforce. So, so everybody's trying. I see lots of questions here, Jim, so I don't want people to get frustrated. Are we gonna?
Yep, let's do that. We had a question about what constitutes historic, and it sounds like our active development people here are working on properties that either are on the register or eligible for the register. Is that generally true?
Well, my first question, I had my own notes here. What is preservation? And we have a very broad definition ourselves of preservation, and it's preserving the character of the neighborhood. And that means a lot of things. It means preserving houses, whether it's to the full historic standard or not, but preserving them rather than having them be blighted and torn down. And even what we consider very nice and architecturally, I'm not going to say totally indigenous design, but fit in. I mean, the best compliment is my good friend Alyssa from Chicago came to visit. I drove her up and down the streets and she said, "You said these houses were not old. They all look the same." That was the greatest compliment because a third of them were new. So we do try to build into the architectural landscape. To us, it's about preserving the neighborhood and the neighborhoods, and it's not just one that we work in. Sometimes it means filling in some vacant lots, and it really mostly means building the community back, both with homeownership and affordable rental. We don't believe that everybody wants to own a home. There are plenty of people who do want to have a very nice place to rent with professional management, which we have taken on, and we are doing that ourselves after years of having third-party management. So for us, preservation is all of this, and Brent is on here and he knows this, that I've asked that the PPS begin to talk about preserving neighborhoods in addition to their all the other wonderful work that they do, that preserving neighborhoods is very important.
We have a couple of questions we might be able to treat together. Someone's writing from New Orleans and saying that they have a large portion of the city in National Register or local historic districts. We also have someone who's asking about the idea of vernacular housing and mentioning the concept of naturally occurring affordable housing, and that maybe historic districts are a way to protect this kind of housing. Any thoughts on the process of districting and encouraging affordable housing? Are districts a friend of affordable housing, or are they a foe?
Well, I seem to always, if you go to the east side of Providence, okay, preserved housing is the foe of affordable housing. It is some of the most expensive rental housing and home ownership in the state. So I think that's one of the reasons that the PPS here is beginning to think more broadly about their preservation and talking about affordable housing and preservation. So I love the term, I forget who said it, I think it was Alyssa, gentle, was it gentle? Preservation. I love the new naturally occurring affordable housing. So this is what I'm going to say. I would love to find some, and I'd love to buy it and preserve it, because it's not going to stay naturally occurring for very long in this market. Naturally occurring affordable housing still in our community means that it's probably well under code, not in very good condition, and it's disappearing. So it's disappearing. And just to give an example, and in the cities you're in, maybe this doesn't mean a lot, but a 60% rent, AMI rent, area median income rent. I think the maximum rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is about $780. I may be off and someone will correct me, I should know this, but just for the purpose of this conversation, let's say it's $780 a month. And right now in our community, relatively low income households, code violated apartments are renting for $1,200 and $1,500 a month. And we think our rents are too high for most of the people in our community. So is that naturally occurring affordable housing by the market standards? The answer would be yes, okay, but it's still not affordable to the people who live in many of the Providence communities and the other urban centers in Rhode Island, period. So I love the phrase, Noah, I can even remember that one, but I think it's disappearing very quickly. I'd love to get my hands on enough of it to be able to deed restrict it and keep it affordable, because it's not going to be affordable for long. Someone's going to go buy it. Jay, you can address this here in Rhode Island. It's tough.
What do you think, Jay?
He didn't hear, because he sees a lot more of it than even we do.
Jay, did you have any particular thoughts about Rhode Island's situation?
He can't hear.
I think I'll jump in here. I think one of the things that I've thought a lot about is that historic neighborhoods generally have been friendly to affordable housing and housing variety and housing options. I think zoning in a lot of ways and historic district overlays have curtailed that in some ways, mostly because of the density aspect. Just sitting here on this call, we've been working on it's a small house. It's probably 1,400 square feet, but it's been a single room occupancy house for decades. It's now blighted, vacant, and we're going to put it back as a duplex. And we submitted our zoning application and just learned, and we should have done this homework before, but we just learned that there are no duplexes allowed in this district. But all down the street, there are 2-story houses that are clearly multifamily houses. There's plenty of affordable housing options on the street, but yet our zoning code won't allow this house to be put back as a duplex. And so, just little wrinkles like that in our zoning code, or even in my neighborhood, it is a local historic district. It's a historic house. I can't build a garage apartment in the backyard because of the historic district. So I think some of these, it's sort of a double-edged sword where the zoning and the historic districts and the design guidelines are protecting the neighborhoods in some ways, but I do think that's something that preservationists should be looking at in terms of allowing this. I think it was the gentle density concept that Alyssa mentioned. So.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. Sorry, I was just going to piggyback off of what Ethiel said, but there are places like Nashville, for instance, has an ADU ordinance that they do allow ADUs and non-attached ADUs as well and stuff. And they just have, they do have to apply to district guidelines and design guidelines and stuff like that, but they do get built. They also, though, are struggling with an issue of people using those for Airbnbs rather than providing affordable housing for their neighbors. So that's another thing that we can think about too, is that in ADU ordinances, making sure that there are protections, that those are getting used for the neighbors and your residents, not for, getting extra money by putting it on the rental market too. So.
Yeah, are you plugged back in now?
Yeah, sorry, I could not figure out how to unmute myself. Yeah, so the only thing I was going to get back to is your initial question about districts, friend or foe. I can say that when I was working for the Community Development Corporation that I referred to earlier prior to joining LISC, it was the Olneyville Housing Corporation. Olneyville is a 1 square mile neighborhood in West Providence that has a couple of really beautiful, historic, architecturally significant mill complexes, and then a whole bunch of worker housing that was built pre-automobile age to provide housing to these workers. Speculative, spec housing at the time, so cheaply constructed on tiny lots. That would that qualify as historic, but don't meet sort of the the glamorous attributes of historic that many people default to, at least around here. And so, anyways, we were proposing to rehab some worker housing that was built in like 1870. And we discovered to our horror that there may have been, some well-intended Brown University student, as a student project, decided that they were going to put an application in to create a historic district along Aleppo Street. And in this particular, that captured some of this housing. And, we weren't, it turned out that the application didn't go through. It was not advanced, but if it had, apologies to Brent, but the buildings on that I'm thinking of on the corner of Bosworth and Pelham Street would have never been built, would have never been rehabbed by Olneyville Housing as they were, because there's no way we could have stuck with whatever historic provisions would have been applied to them at the time. So I think it's, to Carla's point, if you have a historic district, that almost seems to work against, the affordability part, even in neighborhoods like Olneyville, maybe especially in the neighborhoods like Olneyville.
Okay, so we have a definite faux aspect here in those examples. Alyssa, there's a couple of questions about resources and examples of how new construction is or is not more expensive and winds up with housing that is not affordable. And another one about how you can use a central historic district in ways that we're talking about. Are there any particularly good books, reports, things you've worked on that people might find handy?
Oh, I might have to get back to you on that. We do in our reports, we do footnote a lot of resources within them. So, especially in our San Antonio housing study, we have a lot of different reports. We did that study 3 years ago now. So I need to brush up on some of those, but yeah, I think we're constantly just looking for more resources. Every time we find a program that is like, oh, this is neat, this is new, like I literally have an Excel spreadsheet on my computer that's just titled cool programs. And it's just all things that we just kind of stumble across and send to each other and things like that. So it's, yeah, it's you go down a lot of rabbit holes sometimes. And sometimes you find great things and sometimes you don't. But I would say definitely look to our reports. We have great resources listed in footnotes and things like that. Yeah.
I have a question for you, which is for class today. Again, we read the National Trust report, Older, Smaller, Better. And then the Green Lab had been doing several studies like this kind of thing for a while. Any reason why we don't have more of this work? Your firm's doing this kind of stuff, but how can we develop further data on the kinds of things people are trying to convince others of?
Yeah, I think part of it is that preservation, so much of what I do is in GIS and it works with data. It works a lot with census data and assessment data. And I don't think that, and the only reason I'm able to do that is because of GIS. So I think that getting more preservationists involved with tangential kind of urban planning tools and things like that is a really great way to kind of build this, cohort of people who can do this analysis. Because you're right, like the Preservation Green Lab did a lot of great work. And there's only a few firms in the country that kind of specialize in that. So I would just encourage people to start to look into data analysis and what the tools are to do that. And hopefully we can kind of have more people that are able to add their voices to this conversation then.
Terrific. Well, we're kind of reaching the end here, so I want to make sure and leave time for any kind of summary comments people might have. I think we've covered a lot of really good territory about trying to develop mechanisms for capturing value when neighborhood values go up. We talked about the typologies and the gentle diversity, community engagement as a way to try and ensure that the neighborhood's needs are being met. We talked about the need for craftspeople and that may be an opportunity for organizations to make sure that there's going to be the labor force needed in the future. Any last wisdom or advice here among our panelists about what we need to be doing?
I was going to start off with this, so I'll finish with it, is that everything about preservation is good. Preservation of neighborhoods, preservation of mill buildings, preservation, of individual houses. And relative to the work that we do is that every project you do, you're going to have to find more than one source of money, whether it's a home ownership project here, or it's a rental project, or even commercial. We've done some commercial preservation on the south side of Providence. So affordable housing funds can be a gap filler to make historic preservation work financially. And historic preservation funds can help make affordable housing projects work. So, friend or foe, and Jay's examples, and, we all face them. But at the end of the day, there's nothing bad to happen with preservation and affordable housing. And I think we need to be locally and statewide here in Rhode Island and on a national basis to make sure that we keep talking about that. I mean, we have young people who work here and they probably didn't know anything about preserving a house and preserving a neighborhood. And they now know about it. So, I mean, it's all good. It's really all good. So I'm not saying anything bad, Brent. I see you there about the preservation of any properties ever and mill buildings. I wish there were enough money here in Rhode Island. We have more mill buildings than we have sense in Rhode Island. And if we could garner enough resources, and we could probably add 20,000 units of housing, whether it's, deed restricted, affordable or not, if we could find enough money for the mill buildings that are sooner or later just going to tumble into all the rivers. Anyway, that's my pitch.
Thanks, Carla. Your organization SWAP is a great example of how affordable housing and preservation can be good friends. That's terrific. Other thoughts?
I'll say my last takeaway is that I think there's a lot of resources and tools for developers. I mean, we've talked about them. These funding stacks are 7, programs deep and stuff. But I think that we need to really start looking at creating programs for homeowners, for landlords and property owners, mom and pop people, so that they can really, rehab and maintain and keep their units so that they're able to provide them at affordable price, or so that they're able to stay in their property. So I think, part of that is also maybe designation isn't always the right answer. Maybe it's that we just need to start providing programs that are for non-designated pre-1960 housing. So I think it's, twofold. We need to start providing those resources, but we also need to kind of start reframing what we think of as historic. And that designation isn't always the answer for it.
I think we don't use conservation districts as much as we might. That might be an answer to say we're trying to preserve affordable housing and the housing stock, but not necessarily every detail in the way that might get in the way. And in terms of data, I like your example in Chicago, and it suggests that maybe we need more qualitative data that shows the mom and the pop, and we've had this building for 30 years, and we know these tenants, and that's why we're keeping them in place, that kind of stuff. So that's a good example. Ethiel, looks like you're getting ready to give us your last wisdom.
Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to add is a new program, or new to Macon, that we were just sort of experimenting with, and that's the land trust model. And we didn't really get into it today, but I do think that's worth talking about next time. But we've been helpful with a neighborhood that's using land trust model, and it's probably decades away from knowing whether or not it's successful. But to that point early on, that you've got to sow the seeds and you've got to lay the foundation early on before the market takes over. It will be interesting to see how that plays out. So
They use that model, Ethiel, in Newport a lot. We don't use it here in the city, but they're using that model in Newport.
Okay.
Fair amount.
It's a great point. Thank you, Ethiel. And I think many people have done it too late, and it's hard to get older properties, and then they're too expensive to use the power and leverage the value that's gone up. So that's a good suggestion. Jay, last words.
Well, so the only thing I'd add is to get back to a point that you made, Jim, very early in, again, I think it was in your introductory remarks, related to the environmental impact of rehabbing historic properties, whether they be, again, as Carla said, I think of mill complexes just because there's so many in Rhode Island and they're so prevalent. The impacts of rehabbing, one of those versus the impacts of developing, the same number of housing units, let's say on a greenfield site, where you have to, clear cut forest, you have to bring in utilities, you have to pave new roads, you have to do, all those things that you would not, all of which have carbon footprint impacts that you would not see if you, plus you would have to tear down, I suppose if you want to push the model as far as you can, you'd have to tear down one of, an existing mill property in the process. So, there's a lot of excitement around and enthusiasm around, assessing things on a carbon footprint basis, energy impact basis. I think that, historic preservation really acquits itself well under such analysis, and maybe ought to be, that ought to be a lead as we think about these things.
Great, Brent. I'm glad you looked at that as well. If you take down the mill, you're destroying a lot of energy that went into building that and creating a whole new infrastructure for that. And I would also emphasize the social aspect, that, as you've very clearly put it, that these are part of the community, part of the heritage. And if you can reuse it for community benefit, that's a really important spot that historic preservation can play that role. Okay, Brent, we almost out of time. We're going to hand it back to you. Let us go.
Well done, Jim. Thanks for moderating today's conversation. Ethiel, Alyssa, Jay, and Carla, thanks for participating. As you can tell with the large crowd we had from across the country, this is an issue that a lot of preservationists are struggling with. And I think many of you made the points that we have to come up with new tools and new ways of talking about preservation. I think for too long, we've been sitting in the corner advocating for the historic tax credit, but without thinking about how the low-income historic tax credit can be used. So we really have to broaden our perspectives as preservationists if we want to have a role in affordable housing, which we need to. It's desperately needed everywhere. So we will continue these conversations. Thanks all of you for lending your expertise, and thanks to all of our attendees for your valuable questions and comments, and all the work that you do in your communities. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow at our next symposium session. Everyone have a good evening.